Khloe Bennett's fingers brushed against something that shouldn't exist inside an $800 baby onesie. The 27-year-old pediatric nurse, who'd bounced through 7 foster homes before she turned 16 and still rented a tiny studio in Queens she could barely afford, froze in the $1 million nursery as her thumb traced row after row of cactus spines sewn into Italian silk, each one positioned to dig into infant skin with every tiny movement. She flipped the fabric further and found sandpaper, actual sandpaper, glued where soft cotton should have cradled a baby's chest, back, and thighs. Her eyes moved to 4-month-old Mason Thorne lying in his crib, the sole heir to a criminal empire worth billions, and she started counting the red marks covering his 14-pound body. 53 wounds on a baby who couldn't even speak to tell anyone he was being tortured every single day by his own clothes. The woman who'd done this wasn't hiding in shadows. She was upstairs posting Instagram stories to her 4 million followers about the joys of motherhood, a stunning blonde who'd built her entire brand on being the perfect mom. But the real problem wasn't her. It was the man Khloe would have to face if she reported this. Killian Thorne, the most feared crime boss on the East Coast. A man who'd buried enemies for looking at him wrong, and this was his wife she'd be accusing. Khloe thought about her foster mother Maggie dying of cancer in a hospital bed, about the $180,000 in treatment she couldn't afford, about how staying silent meant keeping this job, and maybe saving the only person who'd ever loved her. Then she looked at Mason's exhausted eyes and saw herself at 6 years old, covered in cigarette burns, begging adults to believe her while they looked the other way. There was never really a choice, was there? If you're already holding your breath, smash that like button and subscribe because this is just the beginning. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that sometimes heroes come from the most broken places. What Khloe discovered next would bring a criminal empire to its knees and prove that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about protecting the innocent, even when you're terrified. The sound of Louboutin heels striking the marble floor echoed down the hallway, and Khloe knew she had only seconds left to decide. She quickly hid the bodysuit behind her back, her heart pounding hard in her chest, as Vanessa Hartwell stepped into the nursery doorway like a flawless painting framed by warm golden light. The 29-year-old woman looked as though she had stepped straight off the cover of Vogue. Platinum blonde hair curled into perfect waves, evenly sun-kissed skin, a designer yoga set hugging her body, an outfit Khloe knew cost the equivalent of an entire month's rent for her small apartment in Queens. Vanessa's gaze swept the room, from the crib where Mason lay wearing nothing but a diaper, to Khloe standing stiffly beside the changing table, her posture unnaturally rigid, and Vanessa's perfectly microbladed brows drew together. "Why isn't my son dressed yet?" Vanessa asked, her voice sweet but edged with steel, the tone of someone accustomed to being served and unwilling to tolerate delay. "Killian will be home in 20 minutes, and he wants to hold Mason. You were hired to care for my son, not to leave him lying there naked." Khloe drew in a slow breath, feeling as though she were standing on a cliff, about to jump. She brought the bodysuit out in front of her, turning it inside out to reveal hundreds of tiny cactus spines glittering beneath the crystal chandelier. "Because I found this, Mrs. Thorne." Khloe's voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the fury boiling in her chest. "Can you explain why your son's clothes have cactus spines and sandpaper sewn into the inside?" The air in the opulent chamber froze instantly. Khloe watched Vanessa's face the way a nurse watches a patient, noting every subtle change. Her pupils dilated for half a second. Real shock. Then her blue eyes flicked to the crib where Mason lay. Calculation. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Preparation. And finally, like a mask being carefully put on, the expression of a worried, confused mother appeared. So perfect Khloe might have believed it if she hadn't just witnessed the sequence before it. "What?" Vanessa exclaimed, her voice jumping higher, a hand flying to cover her mouth in a gesture of horror performed with practiced ease. "That's a bodysuit I bought last week at Bergdorf Goodman. It's Italian organic cotton, certified hypoallergenic. There's no way there could be." "There is," Khloe cut in, stepping toward Vanessa with the bodysuit held up. "Look at it. Touch it. Feel the spines. Feel the sandpaper." Vanessa didn't move, didn't reach out to touch the evidence. Her eyes traveled from the bodysuit to Khloe's face, and in that moment, Khloe saw the cold calculation happening behind the facade of panic. "This must be the dry cleaner's fault," Vanessa said, her voice settling back into control. "I send all of Mason's clothes to Madame Laurent's on Madison Avenue. They'll pay for this." I'll sue them into ruin for hurting my son. Dry cleaners don't sew spines into clothing, Mrs. Thorne, Khloe replied, her voice steady now, because she'd seen the truth in Vanessa's eyes, had seen the monster beneath the perfect mask. These spines were sewn in by hand. The stitches are uneven. The thread doesn't match the original fabric. The sandpaper was glued in with specialty fabric adhesive. Someone deliberately altered this bodysuit after it was purchased. Vanessa stepped closer, the space between them shrinking, and when she spoke, her voice dropped into a whisper that was sickeningly sweet. Listen to me, little nurse. You've been here 12 days. You don't know anything about this family, about my marriage, about what's really happening in this house. Do you know who my husband is? Do you know what happens to people who interfere in the affairs of the Thorne family? Khloe didn't step back. She thought of the cigarette burns on her own arm when she was 5 or 6. Thought of the adults who had turned away when she begged them to believe her. She wouldn't turn away from Mason. I know who he is, Khloe said, meeting Vanessa's cold blue eyes. And I know he loves Mason. If he sees the 53 injuries on his son's body, if he learns why Mason cries every time he holds him. Khloe let the sentence hang in the air, and for the first time, she saw something like fear flicker across Vanessa's eyes. The sound of an engine rolled in from the garage. Not the noise of an ordinary car, but the deep, unmistakable growl of a Rolls-Royce Phantom. And Khloe saw Vanessa straighten instantly, like a snake sensing the footsteps of a hunter. In the few brief seconds before the nursery door opened, Khloe watched Vanessa rapidly adjust her expression, erasing the cold menace and replacing it with the gentle smile of a wife waiting for her husband to come home. The transformation was so smooth it was unsettling, as if Vanessa had practiced this moment thousands of times in front of a mirror. Heavy footsteps echoed on the marble staircase, each step measured and deliberate, like a countdown to something inevitable. Then he appeared in the doorway, and Khloe understood at once why the entire city of New York trembled at the name Killian Thorne. He stood 6'3", broad-shouldered, dark hair threaded with a few strands of silver at the temples that lent him the commanding presence of a 36-year-old man who'd lived through more than most ever would. A faint scar ran along his left jaw, the remnant of a failed assassination 5 years earlier that Khloe had heard whispered about, and his ice-cold blue-gray eyes swept the room, registering everything in an instant. A perfectly tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit, a Patek Philippe gleaming at his wrist. Everything about him radiated power and danger. This was the man who controlled 60% of New York's underground operations. The man rumored to have buried enemies for nothing more than looking at him the wrong way, and Khloe was about to accuse his wife of abusing his son. "Why isn't my son dressed?" Killian asked, his voice low and lethal, his gaze moving from Mason lying in the crib, in nothing but a diaper, to Vanessa, then to Khloe. Behind him, another man entered, tall, with close-cropped military hair and eyes that constantly scanned the room as if assessing threats. Khloe guessed this was Ronan Steele, Killian's right-hand man, the one the household staff whispered about with reverence. "Darling," Vanessa began, her voice honeyed as she stepped toward her husband with a radiant smile. "There's been a small misunderstanding. This new nurse is Mr. Thorne," Khloe cut in, her voice shaking, not with fear but with resolve. She knew this might be the last decision of her life. But when she thought of the 53 injuries on Mason's tiny body, she had no other choice. "You need to see this." She stepped forward, holding out the bodysuit turned inside out toward Killian. Vanessa reached out to stop her, but one cold look from Killian froze her in place. He took the bodysuit from Khloe, his brows drawing together as he saw the tiny spines glittering under the light. His finger brushed one of them and he pulled his hand back sharply as the point pierced his skin. A small drop of blood welled on his fingertip, and in that moment Khloe saw something change in those blue-gray eyes. The ice melted, replaced by fire. "What is this?" Killian asked, his voice barely above a whisper, yet more terrifying than any shout. He turned the bodysuit over, his fingers tracing the rows of spines sewn in with care, touching the patches of sandpaper glued where they would rub against a baby's chest, back, and thighs with every movement. "Killian, darling, I can explain," Vanessa started, her voice higher now, faster, the perfect composure from earlier slipping away. "This is definitely the fault of—" Killian lifted one hand, and Vanessa fell silent as if he'd cut off her air. He didn't look at his wife. His eyes stayed fixed on the bodysuit, on the tiny spines designed to pierce his son's delicate skin day after day. Then he looked up, his gaze moving slowly to the crib where Mason lay, his small body marked with red patches that Killian now understood weren't allergies or sensitive skin. "Ronan," Killian said, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "Lock down the entire estate. No one leaves. No one enters." "Killian, you can't." Vanessa gasped, real fear finally breaking through her flawless face. "Silence," Killian said, just 2 words, but enough to make Vanessa step back as if struck. He turned to Khloe, and she felt as though she were being scanned, evaluated, dissected. "You," he said. "Explain. Everything." Khloe drew a deep breath and began to explain everything from the beginning. From the way she'd noticed the abnormal pattern of injuries on Mason's body, the distribution unlike any dermatological condition she'd seen in 7 years as a pediatric nurse, to the moment she decided to examine his clothes and discovered hell sewn inside Italian silk. Killian listened in silence, his face unreadable, but the hand gripping the bodysuit tightened until his knuckles turned white. When Khloe finished, he didn't speak. He simply set the bodysuit down on the changing table and walked toward the crib. Khloe saw Vanessa tense, her eyes tracking her husband's every movement like prey watching a predator. Killian stood beside the crib for a long moment, looking down at his son lying there in nothing but a diaper, the red marks stark against milky white skin. Then he bent down and gently slid his hands beneath Mason, lifting him with a tenderness that looked almost reverent, as if he were holding the most precious thing in the world. And then something miraculous happened. Mason didn't cry. The 4-month-old baby who, according to Vanessa, always screamed whenever his father touched him now lay quietly in Killian's arms, blue-gray eyes identical to his father's gazing up with curiosity and calm. There was no wailing, no struggling, just a baby finally being held by his father, without hundreds of tiny spines piercing his skin. Khloe saw Killian freeze, his eyes widening as he stared down at his son, as if seeing him for the first time. "He isn't crying," Killian whispered, his voice unsteady. 4 months. For 4 months, every time I held him, he cried like I was hurting him. And now, because Mason isn't wearing clothes, Mr. Thorne," Khloe said gently. "Mason isn't afraid of you. He never was. He was in pain. Every time you held him while he was dressed, the spines drove deeper into his skin from the pressure of your arms. He cried from pain, not because he hated his father." Killian slowly lowered himself into the rocking chair beside the crib, Mason still cradled against his chest. He began to examine his son's body, trembling fingers tracing every red mark, every scratch, every abrasion. His lips pressed into a thinner line with each injury he counted. Khloe stood silently, watching the most powerful man in New York count the wounds on his child's body with shaking hands. When he stopped, his voice was barely a strangled whisper. 53. 53 injuries. It was the number Khloe had counted, and hearing Killian confirm it made the truth feel heavier in the room. "Mr. Thorne," Khloe continued, her voice professional but threaded with compassion, "you need to understand the pattern. Mason only cried when he was dressed. Mason only cried when you held him, because you held him after he'd already been dressed. But when Mrs. Thorne held Mason," Khloe paused, glancing at Vanessa standing motionless in the corner, her face drained of all color. "When Mrs. Thorne held Mason, he didn't cry because she undressed him first. He was calm with his mother because she was the only one who didn't hurt him." The silence stretched endlessly. Khloe could hear her own heartbeat, Vanessa's shallow breathing, the soft whisper of wind through the nursery window. Then Killian lifted his head, and Khloe saw something in his eyes that had changed forever. Understanding, realization, and beneath it all, a fury simmering, restrained by iron will but still palpable, like heat radiating from a furnace. "Everything was designed," Killian said slowly, each word falling like ice, "to make me believe my son hated me, to make me think I was a terrible father, to make me feel guilty for working too much, to make me dependent on her because she was the only one who could soothe him. All of it was designed." He turned to look at Vanessa, and Khloe watched the flawlessly beautiful woman take a step back under her husband's gaze, as though she were standing face to face with death itself. "Ronan," Killian called, his voice so calm it was terrifying, the kind of calm that lives at the center of a storm before everything is torn apart. "Take Mrs. Thorne to the security room in the East Wing. Make sure she can't contact anyone." Ronan nodded without the slightest hesitation, as if detaining his boss's wife were the most ordinary task in the world. He moved toward Vanessa with the steady gait of a man accustomed to carrying out orders without question. "Killian, you can't do this," Vanessa screamed, her voice losing all control for the first time, shrill and panicked. "I'm your wife. I'm Mason's mother. You're going to believe a nurse who's been here 12 days over your own wife? She's trying to destroy our family." Killian didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on Mason's face, peaceful in his arms. The baby's tiny hand curled around his finger as if, for the first time, Mason felt safe with his father. "Ronan," Killian said, just one word, and Ronan took hold of Vanessa's arm and began leading her out of the room. She struggled, her gel nails scraping Ronan's skin, but the large man didn't flinch. "You'll regret this," Vanessa screamed as she was dragged through the doorway. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. You think you're powerful? You're nothing. That bitch nurse will pay for this, and so will you." Vanessa's screams echoed down the hallway, growing fainter and fainter until only a heavy silence settled over the sumptuous suite. Khloe stood frozen beside the changing table, unsure what to do next. She just accused the wife of a Mafia kingpin, watched that woman be taken away, and now she was alone in the room with the most dangerous man on the East Coast. Every instinct in her body screamed that she should run, disappear before Killian Thorne decided she was a threat that needed to be handled. But her feet didn't move. Killian remained seated in the rocking chair, Mason asleep in his arms, the baby's small face peaceful for the first time since Khloe had come to work here. A long time passed before Killian spoke, his voice low and weary, completely unlike the cold menace from earlier. "Why didn't you stay silent?" Khloe blinked, not expecting that to be his first question. "You know who I am. You know what could happen if you were wrong. You could have kept quiet, kept your job, kept your life. Why did you choose to speak?" Khloe looked down at Mason sleeping, at the red marks still visible on his milky skin, and she thought of the dark room in her first foster home, of the smell of cigarettes and whiskey, of her own crying that no one ever heard. "Because when I was 6, no one believed me," Khloe said, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet it echoed through the silent room. "I had cigarette burns on my arms and no one even looked. I begged adults to believe me and they turned away. I won't do that to Mason. I won't turn away when a child is hurting." Killian studied her for so long that Khloe felt stripped bare, as if he could read every invisible scar she'd carried for the past 21 years. Then he nodded slowly, a small gesture that held an understanding she never expected from a man like him. "Your foster mother, Maggie," Killian said, making Khloe flinch at hearing the name. "She's at Mount Sinai, stage 3 cancer. You need $180,000 for treatment." Khloe didn't ask how he knew. A man who controlled 60% of New York's underworld would have investigated anyone who entered his home. "I'll take care of it," Killian said simply. "The treatment costs, the best doctors, a private room, all of it." "Mr. Thorne, I can't," Khloe began. "This isn't repayment," Killian cut her off. "It's a deposit. I need you to stay and take care of Mason, at least until I know who else in this house was working for Vanessa, who I can trust. You've proven you're willing to risk your life for my son. In my world, loyalty like that is rarer than diamonds." Khloe looked at Mason sleeping, at the wounds on his small body, then back at the man waiting for her answer. She knew that if she agreed, she'd be stepping into Killian Thorne's world, a world she wouldn't be able to walk away from. But when she thought of Maggie lying in a hospital bed, when she thought of Mason needing someone to protect him, Khloe realized she didn't have a choice. "I'll stay." 1 hour after Khloe agreed to stay, she stood beside Killian and Ronan in front of the door to Mason's walk-in closet, a separate room, nearly 40 square meters in size, dedicated solely to the wardrobe of a 4-month-old baby. When the door opened, Khloe couldn't stop the sharp intake of breath. Hundreds of outfits hung and lay perfectly organized by color and brand, from Gucci Baby to Burberry Kids, from Dior Infant to Armani Jr., each piece priced at or above what she once earned in an entire month, working at a public hospital. Killian didn't waste time. He ordered Ronan to bring everything out, and the 3 of them began the meticulous work of inspecting each item, turning every shirt, every pair of pants, every sock inside out. Khloe showed Killian and Ronan how to spot the tiny spines nearly invisible to the naked eye, how to feel for unnatural roughness in the fabric, how to recognize hand-stitched alterations that didn't match industrial seams. They worked in tense silence, broken only by the soft rustle of fabric and the occasional hiss through Killian's teeth when he found yet another sabotaged outfit. After nearly 3 hours, the final result lay before them like an indictment that needed no words. Of Mason's 89 outfits, 23 had been altered into instruments of torture. Khloe watched Killian stare at the two piles of clothing, one clean and one holding hell itself, and she saw his jaw tighten as if it might shatter. But what caught her attention wasn't only the number, it was the pattern. "Mr. Thorne," Khloe said, carefully arranging the sabotaged outfits into a single line. "Do you see what they have in common?" Killian looked down, blue-gray eyes scanning the clothes. "These are the outfits Mason wore when I was home," Khloe nodded. "I noticed a notebook in the changing room that tracks Mason's daily outfits and who chose them. Every sabotaged set was picked by Mrs. Thorne on days you worked from home or on evenings you came back early. The outfits Mason wore when photographers came for Instagram shoots were all clean." Killian fell silent, absorbing the information. She needed perfect photos for her image as a flawless mother, Khloe thought with disgust. Vanessa didn't want Mason crying in pictures. She only wanted him crying in his father's arms, to serve her manipulation. "Ronan, call Cross. Now," Killian ordered, his voice so cold Khloe felt the room drop several degrees. 30 minutes later, Dr. Julian Cross stepped into the Thorne mansion's living room, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. He'd been the Thorne family physician for 15 years, a 55-year-old man with silver hair and the trustworthy appearance of a seasoned doctor. But his eyes kept avoiding Killian's gaze, and his hands trembled as he set his leather bag down on a chair. "Killian, I heard there was an issue with Mason," Dr. Cross began, trying and failing to sound calm. "I can examine him immediately if you'd like." Killian didn't invite him to sit. He stood by the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, his posture relaxed yet radiating danger, like a panther watching prey. "Cross, how much did she pay you?" Dr. Cross blinked rapidly, his face shifting from surprise to panic, then attempting confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about, Killian. Who paid me what?" "I won't ask twice." Killian's voice didn't rise by even a decibel, but the threat was as clear as a gunshot. Dr. Cross collapsed into the chair like a deflated balloon, his head dropping into his shaking hands. $50,000 a month, he whispered, his voice breaking. "She paid me $50,000 every month to report that Mason had sensitive skin, that the red marks were allergies to detergent or new fabrics. She knew about my gambling debt, $3 million owed to a casino in Atlantic City. She threatened to expose me if I didn't cooperate." Khloe stood in the corner, nausea rising. A doctor, a man sworn to protect patients, had looked at the injuries on a 4-month-old baby and lied to conceal abuse. "Take him away," Killian ordered Ronan. "We'll talk later." As Dr. Cross was led out, Ronan returned holding a phone, his expression grim. "Boss," it cracked Mrs. Thorne's phone. "There are encrypted messages with a number she's been using regularly for 3 years." Killian took the phone, scrolled through the messages, and Khloe saw his face turn to stone. "Cristiano Valenti." He murmured the name as if spitting poison. "Boss," Ronan said, tension tightening his voice. "If Valenti's had someone inside the house for 3 years..." He didn't need to finish. Khloe could see in both men's eyes the realization of something far larger than the abuse of one child. Killian Thorne hadn't just been betrayed by his wife. He'd been stabbed in the back by an enemy for 3 years, without ever knowing it. The security room in the east wing of the estate was fully soundproofed. No noise capable of escaping its thick walls and steel door. When Killian stepped inside with Khloe following behind, Vanessa was sitting on the only chair in the room, her hands cuffed to the metal bar bolted into the table. She looked up at them, and Khloe was surprised to see no trace of the hysterical woman who had been screaming just hours earlier. Instead, Vanessa regarded them with a cold, contemptuous gaze, as if she were the one still in control. "So you finally came," Vanessa said, her voice disturbingly calm. "I'm guessing you found the messages with Cristiano." Killian pulled out a chair and sat across from his wife, less than a meter separating them. Khloe stood in the corner, feeling like she was witnessing a dark play she had no role in yet couldn't look away from. "Tell me," Killian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "From the beginning." Vanessa tilted her head, a faint smile touching her perfectly filled lips. "Which version do you want? The misunderstood loving wife, or the truth?" "The truth." "Fine." Vanessa leaned back, relaxed, as if she were in a spa rather than an interrogation room. 5 years ago, the Hartwell family was on the brink of bankruptcy. My father gambled away everything and owed people he shouldn't have owed. You needed a wife with pedigree to legitimize your image. My father needed money to survive. This marriage was never about love, Killian. It was a business transaction, and you knew that. Killian didn't argue, his face still carved from stone. Continue. 3 years ago, I met Cristiano at a charity gala. Vanessa went on, her tone as detached as if she were talking about someone else. He offered a deal. I'd give him information about your operations, your schedule, your weaknesses, and when he was ready to strike, I'd get $50 million and my freedom. Did you really think I wanted to spend my life as a decorative wife to a mafia boss? Mason, Killian said, just one word, but Khloe heard the tightly caged pain beneath it. What was Mason in your plan? For the first time, Vanessa seemed mildly annoyed, as if the question interrupted her narrative. Mason was an accident. I never planned to get pregnant. But when it happened, Cristiano saw an opportunity. A child would give you a new weakness, distract you, and if I could make you believe your own son hated you, rejected you, wanted only his mother, she shrugged. A man who believes the entire world has turned against him, even his own son, is far easier to defeat. Khloe felt sick listening to Vanessa speak about torturing her child with the indifference of a business strategy. She looked at Killian and saw his hand clenched tightly on his thigh, veins standing out like cords beneath his skin. Did you ever love Mason? Killian asked, his voice unsteady. Even a little? Vanessa looked at him as if he'd asked the most ridiculous question imaginable. Mason was a useful accident, Killian. Nothing more. I never wanted to be a mother. The Instagram photos, the loving captions, that was just marketing. 4 million followers bring in hundreds of thousands a year in sponsorships. Mason was a high-return prop, that's all. The silence that followed weighed so heavily Khloe felt it pressing on her chest. She had seen cruelty before, had witnessed what adults could do to children during her years in foster care. But Vanessa's absolute coldness in speaking about her own son as a tool made her shudder. Killian stood, his face expressionless, his eyes like deep pits of ice. Ronan, call Preston Hayes here tomorrow morning. I want divorce papers and a petition for sole custody. She'll never see Mason again. You can't, Vanessa started, her confidence cracking for the first time. I can, Killian cut in, and you should pray I choose to let the legal system handle you instead of my way. He turned and walked out without looking back. Khloe followed, leaving Vanessa in the soundproof room with furious screams no one would hear. That night, when the estate had fallen into silence, and Mason slept peacefully in his crib, under the watch of a guard Killian trusted, Khloe couldn't sleep. She went down to the kitchen to make tea, and was surprised to find Killian already there, sitting alone in the dark with a glass of whiskey in his hand. He hadn't turned on the lights, only the faint glow of the city beyond the window casting shadows across his exhausted face. Khloe hesitated for a second, then stepped in, poured hot water into a cup, and sat across from him. They sat in silence for a long time, two strangers thrown into the same storm, searching for stillness in the night. 4 years, Killian finally said, his voice rough with whiskey and something deeper. 4 years I thought I had a real family, a wife, not perfect, but mine. A son who cried every time I held him, but I believed he'd grow used to me. I came home every night hoping today would be different, that Mason wouldn't cry when he saw me. He lifted the glass, watching the light pass through the amber liquid. Everything else in my life is violence, transactions, survival. But at home, I thought I could be normal, a normal father. Turns out that was a lie too. Khloe didn't know how to comfort him. She couldn't promise things would be all right because she didn't know if they would. Instead, she said what she knew was true. Mason loves you, Mr. Thorne. He never hated you. And now you have a chance to start again, to show him who his father really is. Killian looked at her in the darkness, and for the first time since Khloe had met him, she saw something other than coldness in his blue-gray eyes, something fragile and unexpected, like hope rising from the wreckage. After the conversation in the kitchen, Ronan escorted Khloe to the room she'd be staying in for the foreseeable future, a space nearly 80 square meters in size, located right beside Mason's nursery. When the door opened, Khloe froze at the threshold, unable to believe what she was seeing. The room was more than twice the size of the cramped studio she rented in Queens, with a king-size bed dressed in pristine white Egyptian cotton sheets, a private marble-tiled bathroom, and wide windows overlooking Central Park, glittering with city lights in the night. She set her worn old backpack down on a velvet-upholstered chair and felt a strange sense of displacement, like a small fish thrown into an unfamiliar ocean. The first thing Khloe did after Ronan left was call Maggie. Her heart pounded as she waited, and when her foster mother's familiar voice finally came through, she nearly cried. "My girl, you finally called," Maggie said, her voice weak but still warm. "They moved me into a VIP room at Mount Sinai. I've got a private doctor checking on me every day, nurses around the clock. They said someone covered all the costs. Do you know what's going on?" Khloe swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I just helped the right people, Mom. You focus on getting better." "Khloe Bennett, I raised you from the time you were 16, Maggie said, her tone sharpening. "I know when you're lying. Where are you? What are you doing?" Khloe looked around the luxurious room, thought of Killian Thorne, the spines hidden in the bodysuit, Vanessa locked in the security room, Cristiano Valenti, and a conspiracy that stretched back 3 years. "I'm somewhere safe, Mom," she said, knowing it was the biggest lie she'd ever told. "I promise." After she hung up, Khloe lay down on the bed but couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned for hours, the images of the day looping in her mind like a horror film with no pause button. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2:47 in the morning when Khloe finally gave up. She slipped a thin cardigan over her pajamas and quietly opened the door, intending to check on Mason. Soft light from the star-shaped night lamp in the nursery spilled into the hallway, and when Khloe stepped inside, she stopped at the doorway. Killian was standing beside the crib, his back to her, a tall, unmoving shadow in the dim light. He wasn't wearing his suit anymore, just a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing tattooed forearms that Khloe guessed bore the Thorne family crest. He stood there watching his son sleep, and something in his posture, in the slight slump of his broad shoulders, told Khloe he hadn't slept either. "You're awake too," Killian said without turning around, as if he had eyes in the back of his head, or was simply so conditioned to vigilance that he sensed every presence around him. Khloe stepped in, stopping a few feet away. "I can't sleep. Neither can I." Silence stretched between them, broken only by Mason's steady breathing and the faint sound of wind outside the window. Then Killian spoke, his voice low and weary, as if he were carrying the weight of the world. 4 months. For 4 months I came home every night eager to hold my son, and every time I touched him, he cried like I was killing him." He paused, his fingers brushing the rail of the crib. "I lay awake every night wondering what I'd done wrong. I read every book on how to be a good father, watched videos, consulted experts. No one had an answer, and Vanessa was always there, comforting me, telling me Mason just needed time, that some babies only bond with their mothers." He turned to look at Khloe, and in the dim light she saw exhaustion carved deep into his sharp features. "I thought I was the worst father in the world. I thought maybe my son could somehow sense what I do out there, what I am, and he hated me for it. I even thought—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Khloe understood. She'd seen that same despair in many eyes, had once seen it in the mirror when she was 10, and believed she was the reason everyone's life around her fell apart. "You're not a bad father," Khloe said gently but firmly. "You were manipulated. Vanessa designed everything to make you feel that way, to break you down, to make you dependent on her. That wasn't your fault. And now that you know the truth, you can start again." Killian looked at her for a long moment in the darkness, and Khloe felt as if something invisible was forming between them, a quiet understanding linking 2 wounded people from very different worlds, standing in this room just before 3 in the morning, watching a sleeping child, both carrying scars no one else could see. 5 days had passed since Khloe's world was turned completely upside down. She'd slowly grown accustomed to life inside the Thorne estate, to meals prepared by a private chef, to caring for Mason in his lavish quarters, to brief encounters with Killian when he stopped by to see his son before work, and again after coming home. That morning, Khloe asked Killian for permission to visit Maggie at Mount Sinai, and he agreed on the condition that a bodyguard accompany her. Khloe didn't argue. She understood that with everything unfolding, safety was no longer something to take lightly. The visit with Maggie went well. Her foster mother looked healthier after days of treatment by top doctors and nurses, and though there were still questions in Maggie's eyes about the source of this mysterious help, she didn't press Khloe for answers. On the way back, as the Thorne estate's black SUV drove through a quiet street in Midtown, everything changed in an instant. A black Escalade blocked their path. 2 more boxed them in from either side, and before Khloe could process what was happening, the The bodyguard in the front seat was dragged out and knocked unconscious within seconds. The door beside Khloe was yanked open, and a man in an expensive gray suit leaned in with a polite smile, as if inviting her out for coffee. "Miss Bennett, apologies for the inconvenience. I'm Cristiano Valenti, and I believe we need to talk." Khloe looked at the man standing before her and felt the blood in her veins turn cold. Cristiano Valenti didn't look like the Mafia boss she'd imagined. He was 42, with perfectly slicked back silver hair, a handsome face, and the friendly smile of a successful businessman you'd expect on the cover of Forbes. But his eyes told a different story, cold and emotionless like a snake's, the kind that saw people as chess pieces to be sacrificed when necessary. "Miss Bennett," Valenti said, his voice smooth as velvet, "I hear you managed to ruin a 3-year plan of mine in a single afternoon. Impressive. Truly impressive." Khloe said nothing. Her heart was racing, but she forced her face to remain calm. Valenti tilted his head, studying her like a scientist examining an intriguing specimen. "I have a proposal. You'll become my eyes and ears inside the Thorne house. You'll tell me everything. Killian's schedule, security details, weaknesses. In return, your foster mother at Mount Sinai will continue receiving the best care available. Maggie's treatment is being paid for by Killian," Khloe said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Killian's money?" Valenti chuckled softly. "And what do you think happens to Maggie if Killian is no longer around? Or if you're no longer in that house to care for Mason?" He stepped closer, and Khloe caught the scent of expensive cologne, mixed with something dark and dangerous beneath it. "Hospitals are very risky places, Miss Bennett. Accidents happen. Medication errors. Equipment failures. Careless nurses. It would be tragic if an elderly woman fighting cancer were to suffer such an accident, wouldn't it?" Khloe felt as if her heart were being crushed in a fist. Maggie, the only person who'd ever loved her unconditionally, the woman who'd saved her from the hell of the foster care system, was now being used as leverage to force her to betray Killian. "You have 1 week to think it over," Valenti said, stepping back with a courteous smile. "I'll be in touch. And Miss Bennett, don't even consider telling Killian about this meeting. I have people everywhere, including inside his house. I'll know." He shut the car door. The Escalades vanished as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving Khloe alone in the SUV, her bodyguard unconscious outside, her entire body trembling. During the drive back to the Thorne estate, Khloe thought she could do what Valenti demanded, try to walk a line between two sides, protect Maggie by betraying Killian. She could stay silent and hope everything somehow worked out. But when she thought of Mason, of those blue-gray eyes so like his father's looking at her with trust, of Killian standing in the darkness at 3 a.m, watching his son sleep with the pain of a father robbed of 4 months of happiness, Khloe knew she couldn't do it. She remembered what Maggie had told her when she was 17, that when life traps you in situations with no right answers, you choose the path you can live with. Not the easiest one, but the right one. Khloe took a deep breath as the car stopped at the gates of the Thorne estate. She would tell Killian the truth, all of it, and she would accept whatever consequences followed, because she was used to standing alone, but she'd never learned how to live with betraying the people who trusted her. That night, Khloe went to find Killian in his study, a spacious room lined with walnut-paneled walls and bookshelves that stretched all the way to the ceiling. He was seated behind a massive oak desk, surrounded by documents and glowing computer screens, yet his eyes weren't focused on any of it, staring instead into empty space. When Khloe knocked and stepped inside, Killian looked up with instinctive wariness, but his expression softened when he saw it was her. "I need to tell you something," Khloe said, her voice trembling slightly despite having steeled herself all afternoon, "and you might be very angry." Killian gestured to the chair across from him, and Khloe sat down, then told him everything. From the moment the Escalade blocked the road, to Valenti appearing with his businessman's smile and snake-cold eyes, to the threat against Maggie and the offer to turn her into a spy, she hid nothing, including Valenti's claim that he had people inside the Thorne estate. When Khloe finished, the silence stretched so long she could hear the wall clock ticking. Killian stared at her without blinking, and Khloe couldn't read what was happening behind those blue-gray eyes. "Why didn't you become a double agent?" Killian finally asked, his voice emotionless. "You could have pretended to agree with Valenti, fed him harmless information, protected Maggie, and stayed here, safe on both sides. Because you deserve the truth," Khloe answered without hesitation. Just like Mason deserves to be safe. I can't tell you I'm willing to risk my life for your son, and then turn around and betray you the moment someone threatens me. Trust doesn't work that way. At least it doesn't for me. Killian leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk, his gaze cutting through her as if searching for something beneath her words. Do you realize this decision could get you killed? Valenti isn't a man who accepts rejection. I know, Khloe said, but I also know that living while having to look at myself in the mirror every day and see a traitor isn't living. I've lost a lot in my life, but I've never lost myself. I'm not starting now. A moment passed. Then something unexpected happened. The corner of Killian's mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to admiration. He stood, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of Khloe. Maggie will be transferred to my medical facility in upstate New York tomorrow. Private doctors. Security 24/7. No one will get near her without my permission. Valenti wants to play games by threatening the innocent. He'll learn that was a mistake. Khloe looked up at him, feeling as though a massive weight had been lifted from her chest. Mr. Thorne, I don't know what to say. Killian? He corrected gently, in a tone she'd never heard from him before. And you don't need to say anything. He studied her for a long moment, and in the warm golden light of the study, Khloe saw something change in his eyes. Something softer, more human. You know, for years, everyone who's come to me has wanted something. Money, power, protection, connections. No one comes without an agenda. But you? He paused, as if searching for the right words. You're the only person in years who wanted nothing from me. You just did what was right, even when it could have killed you. Khloe didn't know how to respond, and maybe she didn't need to. In the stillness of that night, between two strangers who were slowly becoming something else, something had been established. Not a contract or a transaction, but something far rarer and more valuable in Killian Thorne's dark world: trust. 19 days had passed since that fateful afternoon when Khloe turned the bodysuit inside out and discovered hell sewn into Italian silk. 19 days of quiet yet profound changes inside the Thorne estate. Maggie had been transferred to the upstate medical facility exactly as Killian promised, surrounded by the best doctors and security so tight not even a fly could enter unnoticed. Vanessa remained confined in the security room awaiting legal proceedings, and attorney Preston Hayes had finalized the divorce papers along with the petition for sole custody. But the greatest change of all was Mason. That afternoon, Khloe stood in the nursery, looking down at Mason's small body lying on the changing table after his bath, and for the first time in nearly 3 weeks, she didn't see a single red mark. His milky white skin had healed completely, smooth and perfect like that of any healthy 4-month-old baby. She gently dressed Mason in a new bodysuit, one that had been thoroughly inspected and confirmed safe, and he didn't cry or struggle, only gazed at her with clear blue-gray eyes and wrapped his tiny fingers around hers. The sound of a car came from the garage earlier than usual, and Khloe was surprised to recognize the Rolls-Royce belonging to Killian. He rarely returned before 7 in the evening, yet it was only 4 in the afternoon. She lifted Mason into her arms and stepped into the living room just as Killian entered, still in his charcoal suit, but with his tie loosened, his face tired, yet his eyes lighting up the moment he saw his son. Then something miraculous happened. Mason, the baby who had cried every time he saw his father during the first 4 months of his life, now looked at Killian with wide, curious eyes. There was no crying, no fear. Instead, his tiny lips curved upward, his chubby cheeks lifted, and Mason smiled. It was his first toothless smile for his father, the smile Killian had waited 4 months for and believed he would never receive. Khloe watched Killian freeze in the center of the living room, blue-gray eyes wide in disbelief. He stepped forward slowly, as though afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment, and reached out to take Mason from Khloe's arms. When Mason settled into his father's embrace, he smiled even more, his clear infant laughter ringing like wind chimes, his small hand reaching for Killian's face. That was when Khloe witnessed something she never thought she would see. Killian Thorne, the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast, the man New York trembled before, stood in the middle of the living room with his son in his arms, and silent tears streaming down his cheeks. He didn't hide them or turn away. He simply held Mason and cried like a man who had finally recovered the most precious thing stolen from him. Khloe quietly slipped out of the room, giving father and son their privacy, her own eyes burning with unshed tears. That night, after Mason had fallen into a deep sleep, Khloe stood on her balcony, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, glittering with lights. She heard footsteps and didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Killian stood beside her, and they watched the city in silence for a long moment before he spoke. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere, "for everything you've done for Mason, for me." "I only did what anyone with a conscience would have done," Khloe replied softly. "No," Killian said, turning to her. "You did what no one else dared to do. Tell me about you, about your life before you came here." Khloe was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the lights below. Then she began to speak, sharing things she'd never told anyone except Maggie. "My first foster father was named Gerald," she said, her voice distant, as if she were looking back through time. "He was an alcoholic and liked to discipline children with burning cigarettes. I stayed with him for 18 months, until a teacher noticed the burns on my arms and called the police. After that, there were 6 more foster homes, each with its own problems. By the time I was 16, I was in a group home and had nearly given up hope." She paused, swallowing hard. Then Maggie came. She was a retired nurse, 60 years old, living alone, with no reason to take in a 16-year-old girl full of scars and emotional damage. But she looked at me and said, "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself." That was the first time anyone had ever said that to me. When Khloe turned, she saw Killian watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher, deep and complex. He slowly raised his hand and touched her cheek, his fingers warm against skin chilled by the night air. Khloe didn't step back, and she didn't move forward either. They stood there in a suspended moment between two worlds, on a line they both knew they shouldn't cross yet, couldn't bring themselves to turn away from. "You deserve more than this," Killian whispered, his voice rough. "More than a life in the house of a Mafia boss, more than the danger and darkness surrounding me." "Maybe," Khloe whispered back, "but this is where I choose to stay." Killian withdrew his hand and stepped back, re-establishing a safe distance. Yet something between them had changed forever. An invisible thread had been tied, one that couldn't be severed. 26 days after Khloe discovered the spines hidden inside Mason's bodysuit, 3 weeks after Killian Thorne's world collapsed and was rebuilt from the ashes, hell arrived at 2:17 in the morning. Khloe was deep in a dreamless sleep when the alarm sirens tore through the night, the piercing sound echoing through the estate like the scream of a wounded beast. She jolted upright in bed, her heart racing, and before she could gather herself, her door was thrown open. Killian stood there, no suit or tie, only a black shirt and a gun in his hand, his face drawn tight as a wire under the flashing red lights of the security system. "Valenti," he said, just one word. But it was enough for Khloe to understand everything. 20 gunmen are breaching the property. Take Mason and get to the panic room now. Ronan will lead you." Khloe didn't waste a second on questions. She rushed into the nursery next door, where Mason was crying, startled awake by the alarms. She lifted him, clutching him to her chest, feeling his small body trembling against hers. "Shh, it's okay, she whispered, even though she knew it was a lie, even though nothing was okay. Ronan appeared in the nursery doorway, his tactical precision and years of training seemingly having no effect on his speed, his weapon steady in his grip, his eyes sweeping every angle. "Follow me now." They ran down the long corridors, the flashing red lights creating a surreal, nightmarish haze. Gunfire erupted from the lower floors, bursts of shots cracking through the air, mixed with screams and the shattering of glass. Khloe held Mason tighter, shielding his head with her hand as she ran. She ran like she never had before, staying close to Ronan's back through twisting passageways she never knew existed in the estate. They were almost at the panic room when everything fell apart. 3 gunmen appeared at the end of the corridor, and Ronan reacted instantly, shoving Khloe into a wall alcove and opening fire. Khloe curled into herself in the corner, Mason screaming in her arms, and all she could do was squeeze her eyes shut and pray as deafening gunshots exploded around them. Then she heard a groan of pain, and her heart seemed to stop. "Ronan!" she screamed when she saw the big man slump against the wall, blood soaking through his shoulder. But Ronan wasn't down yet. He dropped the last gunman, then turned to Khloe, his face pale from blood loss. "Go on. The panic room door is at the end of the hall. The code is Mason's birthday. I'll cover you." "But you," Khloe started. "Go!" Ronan roared, and she had no time left to hesitate. She clutched Mason and sprinted toward the end of the hall, her fingers shaking as she entered the code on the keypad. and when the thick steel door opened, she plunged inside as if into the arms of salvation. The panic room was a reinforced chamber with steel-lined walls, enough food and water for 2 weeks, and most importantly, a security camera system displaying every corner of the estate. Khloe placed Mason into the portable crib prepared inside, trying to soothe him even as she herself shook uncontrollably. Then her eyes went to the camera screens, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. Killian was downstairs, fighting at least 5 gunmen at once. He'd already taken down several, but his ammunition was limited, and the attackers kept coming like a flood. Khloe watched as he was hit in the shoulder, staggered back, then had his gun kicked from his hand by another attacker. She saw Killian fall, surrounded by 3 gunmen, and she knew that unless a miracle happened, the man who saved Maggie, who showed her that even monsters could have hearts, was going to die tonight. Khloe stared at the security monitors with a heart that felt like it was being crushed inside her chest. Killian was surrounded by 3 gunmen, one knee pressed into his back, a gun jammed against his head, and she knew she had only seconds to decide. Mason lay in the portable crib, no longer crying, watching her with trusting blue-gray eyes identical to his father's. If Killian died tonight, Mason would be an orphan, and Khloe would lose the first man who had ever truly seen her, the first who trusted her not because of what she could give him, but because of who she was. She couldn't let that happen. Khloe turned to the emergency kit inside the panic room, tore through it, and found a taser. Not an ideal weapon, but the only one she knew how to use. She looked at Mason once more and whispered that she'd be back. She promised, then opened the steel door and stepped out. The hallway was pitch black, lit only by the flashing red emergency lights and the distant echo of gunfire from below. Khloe moved like a ghost, flattening herself against the wall, careful not to make a sound. She'd memorized Killian's position from the cameras, the first-floor living room, and she had to reach him before it was too late. She found the service staircase Ronan had shown her during her first days in the house, and crept down 1 step at a time, her heart pounding wildly. As she neared the living room, she heard voices in a mix of Italian and English, heard Killian groan softly, and knew she was in the right place. Khloe pressed herself into a corner and looked in. Killian was on his knees, his hands pinned behind his back by a large gunman, his face streaked with blood from a cut on his forehead. 2 other gunmen stood guard, weapons trained on him, and one of them was speaking into a phone, likely reporting to Valenti. Khloe knew she had only one chance. She waited until the man on the phone turned his back. Then she moved. She burst from the corner, aimed the taser at the man restraining Killian, and fired. The electrodes struck his back, and he collapsed with a howl, his body convulsing uncontrollably. Everything happened in seconds. Killian, freed from the tasered attacker, moved instantly with the instinct of a man who'd survived countless battles. He snatched the fallen gun and shot the second man before he could react. The third fired, and Khloe heard Killian grunt as the bullet tore into his shoulder, but it didn't stop him from returning fire. The third man fell, and the living room dropped into sudden silence, broken only by Killian's labored breathing and the groans of the man on the floor. Killian spoke through clenched teeth, his voice fractured with pain, telling her she was insane and ordering her back to the panic room immediately. Khloe answered that she wasn't going anywhere without him, slipped her arm around him, and hauled him to his feet. He was heavier than she expected, nearly 6'3" and solid muscle, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't normally have. They staggered through the hallway, Khloe nearly dragging him, his blood soaking into her clothes. They reached the panic room just as she heard footsteps rushing toward them. She slammed the steel door shut and locked it, and they collapsed inside like leaves blown by a storm. Khloe didn't pause to breathe. She lowered Killian to the floor, tore open his shirt, and examined the wound. The bullet was still lodged in his shoulder, blood flowing steadily, and without removal he could bleed out. Killian told her there was a medical kit in the corner, and warned her it would hurt. She said she knew, already opening the kit and preparing the tools, telling him there was no anesthetic. He told her he didn't need it, watching her with blue-gray eyes filled with pain and something else she didn't dare name, telling her to do it. Khloe worked. She'd removed bullets and stitched wounds before in emergency rooms, but never like this, never with a patient who held her gaze without flinching, who endured the agony in silence. When she extracted the bullet and began stitching the torn flesh closed, Killian finally asked why she'd come back. Without looking up, she said it was because Mason needed his father. He asked if it was only Mason. Khloe paused for a heartbeat, then continued stitching, telling him he knew it wasn't only Mason. Silence stretched between them, broken only by Mason's soft noises from the crib and the sound of the needle passing through skin. When she finished and bandaged the wound, the noise outside suddenly shifted. Gunfire flared again, but this time it sounded farther away. Then a familiar voice crackled through the radio in the emergency kit. Ronan's voice, weak but alive, saying reinforcements had arrived. Valenti was retreating. The estate was secure. Khloe exhaled as if releasing a crushing weight. And when she looked at Killian, she saw him watching her with an expression she knew she'd never forget. The look of a man who had finally found something he'd stopped believing he deserved. 33 days had passed since Khloe turned the bodysuit inside out and exposed the hell sewn into Italian silk, 1 week after Valenti's attack, and the Thorne estate was slowly returning to normal, or at least normal by the standards of a Mafia family. Killian had recovered with astonishing speed, the wound in his shoulder still bandaged but no longer enough to keep him from work. That morning he summoned Khloe to his study and told her he was going to deal with Valenti once and for all, that she and Mason would have additional security while he was gone, that everything would end tonight. Khloe didn't ask what deal with meant. There were things she didn't need to know and didn't want to know. She simply nodded and told him to be careful. And when Killian looked at her with an unusually gentle expression before leaving, her heart tightened with worry. That afternoon, while Khloe was feeding Mason in the nursery, she heard an unfamiliar sound from the hallway. She listened closely, and her pulse quickened when she recognized the rhythm, not the heavy steps of the guards or the soft tread of Mrs. Walsh, but the sharp click of high heels, a sound so familiar it made her blood turn cold. The nursery door opened, and Vanessa stood there, no longer the flawless, polished woman Khloe had first met. Her platinum blonde hair was tangled, her makeup smeared, her clothes wrinkled as if she'd worn them for days. But what made Khloe leap to her feet wasn't Vanessa's appearance. It was the gun in her hand, aimed straight at her. Vanessa spoke with a wavering voice and wild eyes, asking if Khloe was surprised, sneering that she really thought they could lock her away forever, saying there was always someone willing to help if the price was right. Khloe slowly set the bottle down, stood up, and shifted so her body blocked the crib where Mason lay. She asked what Vanessa wanted. Vanessa laughed, the shrill sound echoing through the gilded nursery, saying she wanted her life back. She wanted the $50 million Valenti had promised. She wanted out of the hell she'd endured for 5 years as a decorative wife to a gangster, and Khloe had ruined everything with her habit of sticking her nose where it didn't belong. Khloe didn't step back, even though the gun was less than 6 feet away. She said she'd saved Vanessa's son from being tortured every day, and if that was interference, she'd do it 1,000 times over. Vanessa stepped forward, eyes red and unhinged, saying Mason had never been her son, that he was a mistake, a burden, a tool, and if she couldn't get what she wanted from him, then no one would. She aimed the gun toward the crib behind Khloe. Khloe stood straight, arms spread wide in front of Mason's crib like a living shield, telling Vanessa she'd have to shoot through her first. Vanessa snarled, asking if Khloe thought she wouldn't, asking what she had left to lose. Khloe said she thought Vanessa was a coward, her voice steady despite her heart pounding like a war drum, saying Vanessa only dared to hurt those who couldn't fight back, a 4-month-old baby who couldn't scream for help, a husband who trusted her and couldn't see the betrayal. But now, standing before someone who could look her in the eye and speak the truth, she was afraid that she didn't have the courage to pull the trigger, that she didn't have the courage to do anything without someone else shielding her. Vanessa's face twisted with rage, her grip tightening on the gun, and Khloe saw her finger begin to squeeze the trigger. Khloe closed her eyes, ready for the bullet, ready to die protecting the child behind her. But the gun never fired. Instead, there was the crash of shattering glass and Vanessa's scream of pain. Khloe opened her eyes and saw Vanessa collapsed on the floor, blood streaming from a wound on her head, the gun skidding across the room. Standing behind her was Mrs. Walsh, the 60-year-old housekeeper who had worked at the Thorne estate for 20 years. Holding the remains of a Waterford crystal vase she'd just smashed over Vanessa's head. Mrs. Walsh said she'd worked in that house for 20 years, that she'd watched Mason grow from his first day, and she wouldn't let anyone hurt that boy, not even his own mother. Khloe stood there, her legs shaking, and for the first time since Vanessa had entered the room, she allowed herself to breathe. Killian returned to the estate less than an hour after Mrs. Walsh had taken Vanessa down, and the look on his face when he saw the scene in the nursery was something Khloe knew she would never forget. Vanessa was still unconscious on the floor, her wrists tightly cuffed by Ronan even though she wasn't going anywhere. The blood from the wound on her head already dried into a dark red streak against her platinum blonde hair. Killian stepped past her as if she were a pile of trash, went straight to Khloe where she was sitting in the rocking chair with Mason in her arms, his eyes sweeping over her body to check for any sign of injury. "Are you all right?" was the first thing he asked, not asking about Vanessa, not asking what had happened, but asking about her. Khloe nodded, not trusting her voice if she opened her mouth. Killian knelt in front of her, one hand gently touching Mason's head as the baby slept, unaware of the storm that had just passed. The other resting on Khloe's knee as if he needed to confirm that she was really there, really safe. Then he stood and turned toward Vanessa, and Khloe saw his jaw tighten, saw his hand curl into a fist, saw the rage boiling beneath the calm surface. She knew that in Killian's world, what Vanessa had done carried only one punishment, and it wasn't prison. "Ronan," Killian said, his voice cold as ice. "Call our contact at the FBI." Ronan looked so shocked he didn't even try to hide it, and Khloe felt the same. The FBI was the natural enemy of men like Killian, the constant threat he'd spent his entire career avoiding. The idea that he would reach out to them willingly was unthinkable. Boss Ronan asked, as if he needed to be sure he'd heard correctly. "Call them," Killian repeated. "Tell them I have evidence of child abuse, conspiracy with Cristiano Valenti, and enough information to open a RICO case. Tell them I'm willing to cooperate if they want Valenti served on a silver platter." 2 months later, Khloe sat in the living room of the Thorne estate, watching the news coverage of the trial's conclusion. Vanessa Hartwell, her maiden name since she'd lost the right to the Thorne name long ago, had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison on charges of child abuse, conspiracy, and complicity in criminal organization activities under the RICO statute. No possibility of parole for the first 12 years. All parental rights permanently terminated. The image of Vanessa being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, the face that once graced magazine covers now pale and aged by a decade, was one Khloe knew would haunt her for a while. Not out of pity, but because it reminded her of the cost of cruelty. Killian walked into the living room and sat beside her, his eyes also fixed on the television where reporters were talking about the fall of a multi-million follower influencer. "You've wondered why I didn't kill her?" Killian said. Not a question, but a statement. Khloe nodded. She had wondered that for 2 months. "Because of you," Killian turned to her, and in his eyes was something soft she'd begun to recognize. "You showed me there was another way. That violence isn't always the only answer." And more importantly, he paused, looking toward the nursery where Mason was napping. Mason shouldn't grow up with a father who killed his mother, even if that mother was a monster. This way, he'll grow up knowing his mother is paying for what she did, but his father isn't an executioner. Khloe looked at the man sitting beside her, the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast, who had chosen justice over revenge, and she realized she was seeing a version of Killian Thorne that perhaps no one else ever had. 6 months had passed since the day Vanessa was sentenced. 6 months of changes Khloe never imagined she would live to see. Maggie had been declared cancer-free, her latest tests all coming back clean, and she'd moved into the guest house on the Thorne estate at Killian's invitation, an offer Maggie had initially refused because she didn't want to be a burden, before finally accepting when Killian said Mason needed a grandmother. Khloe had stayed on to care for Mason, but her role had long since shifted, no longer just a nurse or a nanny, but something no one bothered to name because everyone could see it. And Killian had been courting her for 6 months, in a way she never expected a Mafia boss to court anyone. Not with lavish gifts or grand promises, but with small, deliberate acts that carried real weight. He came home early every evening to have dinner with her and Mason. He asked her opinion on every decision involving his son. He remembered she liked Earl Grey tea and made sure there was always a fresh box in the kitchen. He looked at her as if she were the most valuable thing in a house filled with million-dollar paintings and priceless antiques. But every time Killian moved closer, Khloe took a step back. Not because she didn't feel anything for him, but because she was afraid. Afraid she didn't deserve something good. Afraid that if she allowed herself to love, she'd be hurt the way she always had before. Afraid that she, a child passed through 7 foster homes, simply wasn't made to be loved. Tonight, Khloe stood on the balcony overlooking Manhattan as she had so many times before, the city lights shimmering below like an ocean of stars. She heard the familiar footsteps and didn't need to turn around to know Killian was behind her. He stood beside her in silence for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and weary, as if he'd been carrying a weight for too long. "I'm not a good man, Khloe," he said, his gaze fixed on the distance. "I've done things you'd never forgive if you knew the details. My hands aren't clean, and they probably never will be. I can't promise you a normal, safe, simple life the way other men can." Khloe turned to look at him, at the sharp lines of his face, the faint scar along his jaw, the blue-gray eyes holding a vulnerability he showed only to her, at the man who had saved Maggie, protected Mason, and waited for her for 6 months without complaint. "I know," she said, and her voice didn't shake the way she thought it would. "I know who you are, Killian. I know your world, and I'm still here." Killian turned to her, and in the warm light spilling from the living room, Khloe saw something in his eyes finally break, the last wall falling, and he looked at her without hiding anything. "You deserve better than me," he whispered. "Maybe," Khloe replied, and for the first time, she stepped forward instead of back. "But I don't want better. I want you." Killian lifted his hand, touching her face the way he had months ago on this same balcony, but this time neither of them pulled away. His fingers traced the curve of her cheek, her jaw, and when he leaned down, Khloe closed her eyes. Their first kiss wasn't a blaze of fire but the lighting of a candle, slow and gentle, filled with care and restraint. Killian's lips were warm against hers, one hand cradling the back of her neck, the other around her waist as if she were something precious that could break. And Khloe, for the first time in her 27 years, allowed herself to be loved. She didn't step back, didn't search for reasons to run, didn't tell herself she wasn't worthy. She simply stood there, in the arms of the man the world feared but who held her like a treasure. And she let the tears fall down her cheeks because at last, she had found home. 4 years after that first kiss on the balcony, the Thorne estate was filled with laughter and bright balloons on Mason's 5th birthday. He ran across the garden with children from his kindergarten, dark hair bouncing and blue-gray eyes sparkling with joy, with no trace left on his body or his spirit of the wounds from years ago. Child psychologists had confirmed that Mason carried no lasting effects from the abuse he suffered when he was too young to remember, and he grew up healthy, happy, and deeply loved. Khloe stood on the porch watching her son play, one hand resting on her 6-month pregnant belly, round and full, the other holding a glass of lemonade Maggie had just made for her. A platinum wedding band set with a blue sapphire glittered on her ring finger whenever the sunlight caught it. The ring Killian had slipped onto her hand during their small, intimate wedding with only family and a few trusted people 2 years earlier. She had chosen sapphire instead of diamond because she never cared for extravagance, and Killian had laughed and said she was the only woman he knew who would turn down a diamond. "Mommy, Mommy, look at me," Mason shouted as he ran toward her, holding a superhero balloon, his chubby face glowing. Khloe bent down to catch him, as much as her belly allowed, and kissed his forehead. Hearing Mommy still made her heart tighten every time, even after hearing it thousands of times over the past 3 years since Mason began to speak and naturally chose that name for her. She had never asked, never suggested it. Mason had chosen it himself, and it was the most precious gift she had ever received. Grandma Maggie, come play with me," Mason said, tugging at Maggie's hand as she sat beneath the oak tree in a wicker chair, a 75-year-old woman with white silver hair and a gentle smile. Maggie rose, slower than before, but strong, cancer now a distant memory, her doctors having declared her fully healthy at her most recent checkup. She lived in the guest house on the estate, close enough to see Mason every day and private enough to have her own space, and she often said these later years were the happiest of her life. Killian stepped out from the house into the garden with a smile only his family ever saw. He had changed greatly over the past 4 years, not only as a man but in his empire as well. 60% of the Thorne empire now operated entirely above board, high-end real estate in Manhattan and Brooklyn, a fast-growing tech company in Silicon Alley, a chain of luxury restaurants along the East Coast. He had told Khloe that in 10 years their daughter wouldn't inherit dirty money, and she believed him. Khloe still worked part-time in pediatrics at Mount Sinai, not for money but because she couldn't abandon the work that shaped her. She had refused every suggestion to stay home and simply be Mrs. Thorne, and Killian never pressured her. He understood that Khloe needed to be herself, to feel valuable not because she was his wife or Mason's mother, but because of what she did for other children who needed her. Watching Mason run to Killian and be lifted onto his father's shoulders, watching Maggie smile with missing teeth as her grandson handed her a piece of birthday cake, watching a house once filled with shadows and secrets now echo with children's laughter. Khloe placed her hand on her belly where her daughter kicked softly, and she knew this was the life she never dared to dream of, but had always deserved. That night, after the birthday party had ended and Mason was fast asleep in his room with his new superhero pillow tucked under his arm, Khloe stood in the nursery being prepared for their daughter's arrival. The room was painted a soft blush pink, the white crib already assembled, plush toys neatly arranged on the shelves, and Mason had carefully placed his favorite teddy bear inside the crib to save a spot for his baby sister. Khloe stood by the window, gazing down at the shimmering lights of Manhattan below, when she felt familiar arms wrap around her from behind, Killian's warmth settling against her back, his hand resting on her pregnant belly, where their daughter kicked gently, as if greeting her father. They stood there in silence, and Khloe let her mind drift back through distant years. She thought of the 6-year-old girl with cigarette burns on her arms, begging adults to believe her while they turned away. She thought of the 16-year-old in a group home who had nearly given up hope until Maggie appeared. She thought of the 27-year-old nurse living in a cramped studio in Queens, working 12-hour shifts and still unable to afford treatment for the woman who had saved her life. And she thought of the moment that changed everything, the quiet, fateful second when she chose to turn over a silk bodysuit in $1 million nursery. Sometimes the smallest decisions change everything. Not the world in its vast sense, but the worlds of the people closest to us. Khloe saved Mason by turning over a piece of clothing. She found a family by refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. She learned she was worthy of love by allowing herself to trust one more time. This story isn't just about Khloe, or Killian, or Mason. It's about all of us, about those moments when we stand at the crossroads between staying silent for safety and speaking up for what's right, about the times we notice something wrong and convince ourselves it isn't our place to get involved, about the children waiting for someone brave enough to truly see their pain. The lesson this story leaves us with is simple and profound. Always listen, always observe, and always act when you see someone in need, even if they can't speak for themselves. Children can't speak up on their own, but we can speak up for them. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel or reflect on something deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more meaningful stories each day. Share this video with the people you love, because it might be the inspiration someone out there is waiting for. We'd truly love to hear what you feel deep in your heart. What did you think of this story? Have you ever witnessed a moment in life when a small decision changed everything? Leave a comment below and share your story with us. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you and your family good health, joy, peace, and happiness every day. Remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is protecting the innocent, even when your hands are shaking. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.